So, if you're confused why I'm here, me too. Welcome to the podcast. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Too Scared to Ask podcast, which is my new little creative pursuit / passion project. I'm so happy that you're here, choosing to join me on this journey. I'm a little nervous and I don't entirely know what I'm doing, but I am very excited and very grateful for your support. As you might be able to tell, this will be my learning series while I get used to the world of podcasting, but I hope that doesn't deter you from listening, and you'll choose to bear with me through this scrappy startup season. I promise I'll do my best to build this pod into something that's considered truly quality content. So, since this is the first episode, I thought I'd start by giving you some context, some background, a little get to know me, if you will. Let's start with the why I started a podcast, and more specifically, this podcast. This podcast was inspired by so many things. Firstly, by my love of podcasts. Anyone who knows me knows I listen to a minimum of one podcast a day, but really, most days it's more like 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 podcasts. You might be thinking, where do you find the time? Or why do you consume so many podcasts? Well, I'm not much of a music listener, but I am an avid podcast consumer because, frankly, I just love the diversity of content from education to comedy to downright unhinged chats with friends. To me, podcasts are a uniquely immersive experience that oftentimes create a sense of intimacy other forms of media don't. There's just something about the audio style format that makes it feel like when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm really just listening to a voice memo from my best friend. Or in the case of multi-person shows, sitting around with a group of friends, actively absorbing the conversation, ready to laugh and cry right alongside them. So, in moments when other people might choose to play music, I tend to pick a podcast. For example, every time I'm driving, I have a podcast on. And as someone who lives in Southern California, I spend a lot of time in the car. So in that space alone, I log a good amount of podcast listening hours. Apart from the car, cleaning, podcast on. Cooking, podcast on. Taking a bath, you guessed it, podcast on. What can I say? I'm obsessed. I'm just a podcast girly. So here I am, taking my love of podcast consuming to hopefully a love of podcast producing. I will not lie, so far it's been a little bit tricky. Nobody told me how hard it was to record and edit a gosh dang podcast, but that's okay because ultimately any creative endeavor is for the creator. And as long as I'm having fun, I think that's what matters. Well, it does also matter to me that you're having fun, but, hopefully we'll get there. The editing will get better, the production will get better, and all in all, praying your enjoyment will also get better. So, back to why I started this pod specifically. Too Scared to Ask came about because for years now, I've been having conversations with friends, and believe it or not, sometimes even strangers, that they weren't having with anyone else in their life. Conversations about topics that seemed a little too scary or intimate to ask about or talk about with just anyone. Conversations that required a lot of courage and vulnerability to bring up. Oftentimes, those heart-to-hearts were filled with little nuggets of wisdom, lots of self-reflection and self-realization, and ultimately led to personal growth. Through these conversations, I realized that the insights gained were things that other people could benefit from hearing, and often others agreed. Soon, I had friends, family, and the occasional stranger telling me, you should start a podcast. So after finally getting over myself, my fears, and my limiting beliefs, I'm here, starting a podcast. A little disclaimer, I feel like I'm still in my growing up era, and I have a feeling I won't be leaving it anytime soon. So please know everything I share is just my personal thoughts and experiences. If you hear something and it doesn't resonate, just ignore it. This podcast is ultimately just a creative form of self-expression and self-exploration, a way to share more of myself with you. Nowadays, there's so much content out there that I'm certain if mine doesn't float your boat, someone else's will. My hope is just that you're able to gain something from listening, whether it's an aha realization, a feeling of connection, or just pure entertainment. So, is this the podcast for you? I don't know. But a few things you can expect from Too Scared to Ask is a mix of solo and guest episodes, hot take topics, self-development talks, and of course, featured questions you'd normally be too scared to ask. Now, on to a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Natalie. I'm currently in my late 20s. Ugh, wild. Time flies. I recently received my second kidney transplant just about 2 months ago. More on that in a future episode. And I've self-labeled this season of life The Embrace because it's all about embracing new adventures and endeavors. What else can I say? I have a bachelor's degree in international relations with an emphasis in peace and security and a concentration in Eastern Europe. And I have a minor in human rights. I chose to do my concentration in Eastern Europe because my family is from Eastern Europe. I am actually Czechoslovakian. My mother is from the Czech Republic and my dad is from Slovakia. For those of you curious, yes, I do speak both Czech and Slovak fluently. Ahojky, jak se máš? And I try to visit my family at least once a year. It's been a little bit difficult the last few years with all of my health issues, but I'm looking forward to being able to travel again and revisit some family. Speaking of travel, I am a huge traveler. Traveling is my love language. I wish that I could spend all of my time, money, life, just visiting new places. There's, to me, nothing like the thrill of travel. I love meeting new people from all around the world, trying new foods, and exploring all the nooks and crannies of our beautiful earth. I'm also a big reader and I quite enjoy exploring the worlds of fantasy fiction. Any book with solid and creative world building has my respect. Though fantasy fiction isn't the only genre I like, I read it all from fiction to nonfiction, history to contemporary, religious and spiritual, and of course, self-development. Most recently, I've been reading Atlas of the Heart, Mapping Meaningful Connection and the Language of Human Experience by Brené Brown. I'm a little late to the game. I know this book was published back in 2021, but I'm kind of a firm believer that things and people always find you when they're meant to, because God always knows the best time for you, even if you don't. Since we're on the topic of books, I absolutely have the full intention of having book episodes, episodes where I recommend certain reads for certain genres. You might be wondering how that's relevant to the Too Scared to Ask part of the podcast, but I'd like to think we've all been scared to ask for book recommendations about topics that we feel like at our age we should already know about, like managing finances, for example.
Money.
But even if you don't see the relevance, it meets the goal of the podcast, which is ultimately to help you learn and grow through every conversation. Besides, I think now more than ever, when we live in a world where information is so readily available and there's so many books and articles and things that we can learn from, it can be a little bit difficult to know where to start or discern what kind of read you might want to pick up. So I think it's nice to have resources like a podcast episode that breaks down options and summaries of books that might be a good place to start, depending on what it is that you're looking for or hoping to learn about. I can even add a Q&A section of all those questions you've been wanting to ask in relation to books. Again, this podcast is in its infancy. It's in its learning and growing season, so we'll figure it out together as we go. Speaking of doing things together, I don't want this podcast to be a one-sided conversation. I want to hear from you. I want to know all your questions, your problems, your thoughts, or things that you want to hear on upcoming and new episodes. And you can share that with me by DMing this pod's Instagram at Too Scared to Ask Pod. As mentioned in the trailer, no question or topic is off limits, so ask me anything, and I'll do my best to answer right here on the Too Scared to Ask podcast. Well, I think that's a good place to end it for today. I just want to say thank you for being here and choosing to share your time with me. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to episode 1. Please follow, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll catch you again soon. Bye.